Welcome back to English and the Beauty of Language. Today I'm going to be talking to you again about Shakespeare's powerful women, or rather, the influence of powerful women on Shakespeare's work. Um, that is, in a time of patriarchy, that is a male dominated world, um, Shakespeare's society was conflicted between contests between powerful women, particularly obviously early in her life, Elizabeth had to negotiate the potential conflict anyway with her sister, Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor, the queen who preceded Elizabeth, her older sister, Henry VIII's first child, who he pushed aside in his famous, notorious pursuit of a son and heir. Mary was the only child of his first very long marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the princess from Spain. And Henry, through frustration at not being able to have a son, divorced Catherine and pushed aside his eldest child. And then he had Elizabeth with Anne Boleyn. Turned on her mother, had her executed, again famously, Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, whom he divorced Catherine, caused an enormous amount of trouble. And then they fell apart, fell out with each other, and Henry had her executed as a traitor. That's Elizabeth the First's mother. Her father, King Henry VIII, had Elizabeth's mother executed as a traitor when Elizabeth was just a child. Henry then had a son with his third wife, who died in childbirth, I believe. Anyway, and of course, Henry notoriously had six wives, two of whom he had killed. We'll talk more about Henry another day. I'd love to do a video about Henry VIII, a fascinating man who changes England fundamentally and in many, many ways, and shapes the future of his nation in many ways, some of which perhaps even he didn't anticipate. Anyway, but then in the second half of her life, the main part of her life in her reign, Elizabeth had a conflict with Mary, Queen of Scots, another Mary. Obviously, you can think for yourselves, particularly students, why so many women, particularly powerful women in this period, were called Mary. Think obviously about the Christian context of this society and the significance of the name Mary for Christian culture. So we have Mary, Queen of Scots. This is a cousin of Elizabeth's. Henry VIII's sister married the King of Scotland. And so this is Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII. So her aunt, Elizabeth's aunt, married the King of Scotland. And so Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, are cousins. As you often see in the relationships between the European royal families, they're intermarried. But obviously, particularly the royal family of England and Scotland, which of course, in a sense, merges with the Stuart dynasty that follows Elizabeth. And we'll talk about that another time as well. Elizabeth was vulnerable, of course, because she had no children. She never married. She's known as the Virgin Queen because she never married. Elizabeth wasn't a virgin. She had well known to have had two lovers, two boyfriends in her life. Lord Dudley, I think it was the first one, who was her main boyfriend for most of her life. But Elizabeth refused to marry for political reasons. It wasn't because she didn't want to have a lover or because she wasn't interested in men at all. Elizabeth must have been quite a lively character. She was quite a lady. But she wouldn't marry because she wanted to keep the power for herself. And I don't think it was just necessarily a selfish action. I think she felt it was her duty to stabilise England and the monarchy. Anyway, it's hard to know, of course, what was really in Elizabeth's mind. There are lots of wonderful shows. You've got David Starkey's wonderful series Monarchy, and David Starkey is an expert on Tudor England. And there's lots of other wonderful shows about these. There's the fabulous movie Elizabeth, wonderful English movie, which is it's got so many good actors. It's a fabulous film about Elizabeth's life. But Elizabeth was vulnerable because she didn't have any children. The first job of a monarch, once they become a monarch, is to have an heir, to produce an heir. And Elizabeth, because she wouldn't marry, didn't have an heir. So that made her extremely vulnerable throughout her life. And Mary, Queen of Scots, did have an heir, James, her son James. Mary's life was tempestuous. She was a very unpopular lady. She had a wild relationship with her husband, Lord Darnley, I think his name was, and she had him eventually murdered, or she is suspected of having Lord Darnley murdered, her husband, James I's father. His mother, again, see the connection with Elizabeth and Henry. Henry had Elizabeth's mother executed. James the King of England after Elizabeth, the King of Scotland, his mother had his father murdered. Now, Henry killed Anne Boleyn legally. He had her, declared a traitor and killed her. And Mary, Queen of Scots, had Lord Darnley murdered, not legally killed. But I mean, the differences are, important, I guess. But still, imagine living in a world like that Machiavellian world of power and intrigue and betrayal. Mary was forced to abdicate in 1567. Mary, Queen of Scots, abdicated in 1567, right in the middle of during Elizabeth's reign. And then that intensified the danger in many ways because Mary started eyeing off the English crown. She was Elizabeth's closest relative, and her son was the closest heir to the throne. And so Mary started intriguing against Elizabeth I. There were many, many intrigues, and Elizabeth had various opportunities to assail Mary and accuse her of treachery. But Elizabeth was reluctant. She didn't want to kill Mary. And you might just think about why that is. And I'm going to make another video where I go into that in more depth about regicide and about the execution of monarchs and what that means to other monarchs. We must remember this is a small pool. Kings and queens are not on every street corner. Certainly not today, of course, but even back then, they're a small club, very often related to each other. So obviously for one monarch to have another monarch executed, even one who's abdicated, you can never stop being a monarch. You can stop ruling. Your reign can be taken away from you. You can abdicate or be forced out, or you can even be killed. But you're still a monarch. You're anointed as a monarch. And the symbolism and the significance of that to other monarchs is enormous. So Elizabeth she resisted having Mary. Eventually Mary falls into Elizabeth's power, and Elizabeth has her held in house arrest in England for many, many years. Mary, Queen of Scots, is executed in 1587. So she abdicated in 1567, and she was executed in 1587. Elizabeth died in 1603. So you can see how long, I'm not sure exactly how long Mary was held captive by Elizabeth, but Elizabeth held off killing her for a very long time because she didn't want to set a precedent of executing a fellow monarch, let alone a fellow queen. The significance of that, given the strife and the problems of the previous generations with the Reformation and the War of the Roses, as I've talked about in other videos, and then, of course, what's about to happen in the future with the English Civil War, where they do finally execute a king. The Parliament executes a king legally. So I'll wrap that up for now, but Mary, Queen of Scots, there's a fascinating dichotomy in the power struggle between Elizabeth and Mary and their common experiences. Elizabeth's common experiences with James I of having their parent executed by one of their other parents. It's an extraordinary Machiavellian world that they lived in, and that's one of the reasons why Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince and his ideas about princedom and lordship are so significant at that time. So thank you very much. I'll make my next video about a similar topic. Thank you.